All right, thank you so much. Thank you to the conference organizers and all the presenters for such wonderful papers. I want to dig right in with my research questions. One is, how is knowledge of the senses created? And the second is, why do consumers' tastes and sensory perceptions resist standardization? I think it's really tempting to view sensory knowledge creation as a top-down process guided by flavor scientists, color specialists, and other sensory engineers. But I argue that the creation of sensory knowledge was a multifaceted process in which ordinary consumers, market researchers, and advertisers also figured as important creators, translators, and disseminators of sensory knowledge. In taking North American whiskey as my subject, I'm particularly interested in how the language of gustatory taste became entangled with implicit and explicit discussions of intoxicated states. As mid-century market researchers and advertisers came to understand, when consumers expressed a preference for mild, smooth, and light whiskey, they were not just describing taste. They were also describing the type of intoxicating experience they preferred, one that enabled drinkers, usually men, to manage the demands of liquor-fueled sociability and business networking and still meet their workplace obligations the next day. My research draws upon the marketing research studies that Ernest Dichter conducted for whiskey firms between the late 1940s and early 1960s. A pioneer of motivational research, the psychoanalytically trained Dichter conducted in-depth interviews with consumers to determine the hidden reasons that determined their likes and dislikes. And one of the things that his studies sought to explain was what Dichter saw as a central paradox. Even though whiskey drinkers often failed to distinguish between brands and taste tests, they nevertheless relied heavily on the language of gustatory taste to articulate their whiskey preferences. In fact, Dichter assumed that consumers unfailingly listed taste, smoothness, and the absence of after effects in that order as the most important attributes of whiskey quality because they were simply parroting advertising claims. So in my talk, I want to explain how consumers use this vague language of gustatory taste to talk not just about the sensory experiences of taste and intoxication, but also to make statements about their class and masculinity, and to draw boundaries of inclusion and exclusion. I'll then explore briefly how market researchers and advertisers translated consumers' sensory perceptions into marketable messages. And the first example I want to give makes the point that sensory perception is not just rooted in physiology, but it also has cultural and even political dimensions. As many papers have noted in this conference, flavor can be notoriously difficult to describe. And Dichter found that consumers were actually much better at describing what they disliked in a whiskey than what they liked. One drinker, who regarded himself as a connoisseur, explained that he liked bourbon's pleasant aroma because it didn't smell like gasoline or medicine, and it didn't taste too sharp or harsh. The fact that consumers relied so heavily on negative test descriptors had much to do with post-war consumers' memories of degraded whiskey quality during World War II. Having halted beverage production to make industrial alcohol for the war effort, some distillers turned to alternative sources to meet the wartime demand for whiskey. Shenley used cane sugar, potato spirits, and redistilled brandy to stretch its supply of aged whiskey during the war, a combination that by many accounts produced an odd tasting, unpleasant, and physically punishing blended whiskey. Shinley's Black Label blended whiskey gave wartime consumers such terrible hangovers and upset digestions that some dubbed it the Black Death. Wartime whiskey shortages, however, left consumers with few alternatives, and many resented Shinley for knowingly supplying an inferior product. Shinley relaunched a superior version of its Black Label after the war, but it struggled to gain consumer acceptance, even though few could taste the difference between Seagram and Shinley. Consumers still thought more poorly of Shinley and feared being judged down at the heels if they served it to guests. And this, to me, is a really good example of how historical memory can influence sensory perceptions of taste. Historian Laura Shapiro has called memory the sixth taste and the strongest of all, one that operates apart from any objective evaluation of food. The taste of Shinley that lingered in consumer sensory imagination was the taste of deception. My second example emphasizes how whiskey makers struggled to manage sensory perceptions because consumers' perceptions of taste were influenced by the social and cultural context in which drinking took place. When Dichter's respondents talked about their sensory perceptions of taste, they also revealed their cultural attitudes toward intoxication and anxieties about overindulgence. Most of Dichter's respondents seem to view the mildness or harshness of whiskey's intoxicating effects as a component of its taste. The whiskey that tasted best was the whiskey that produced the most ideal altered state. Consider the reflections of an Oak Park salesman on the pleasures of bonded bourbon. Some people drink to forget and others drink for taste. If you drink to forget, any old drink will do. If you drink for taste and quality, you would have to drink bonded. The irony here was that bonded bourbon was at 100 proof, the strongest whiskey on the market. Dichter's respondents repeatedly drew contrasts between those who drank for pleasure and those who drank for effect, in part because the stakes of losing control were so high. As one respondent noted, a man in my position can't afford to have hangovers and suffer the lost productivity and social prestige. Despite their self-avowed commitment to moderation, drinkers convinced themselves that the supposed purity of Scotch, bonded bourbon, and straight bourbon also made it possible to drink more rather than less. Consider the respondent who enjoyed drinking bouts with friends in which they emptied a bottle of Scotch together. We were discussing who could drink the most and the fastest without feeling any bad effects. My friend said Scotch was the only drink if you don't want to get a hangover. This example hints at the ways white upper middle class men work to reconcile the demands of masculinity with the demands of respectability. The Scotch itself conferred prestige and respectability, while men's ability to drink voluminously without consequences demonstrated their drinking prowess. Given the shortness of time, rather than explaining how Dichter helped clients translate consumer sensory experiences into marketable messages, I'm going to conclude with an example of how advertising constructed new appeals in response to feedback from market researchers and changing consumer tastes. In the late 1950s and early 60s, American whiskey began losing market share to Scotch and the so-called white liquors, which would be gin and vodka. These lower proof spirits all touted their lightness, which was a buzzword that reflected the growing cultural salience of moderate drinking. Seeking to exploit these trends, Seagram debuted Calvert Extra, an 86 proof blended whiskey, in 1962. Magazine ads presented Calvert Extra as a soft whiskey that does everything hard liquor can do, but it does it softer. The ad's closing lines claim that those who drink, who may try the drink, may never touch a drop of hard liquor again. At a press conference, Seagram's chief blender explained that the distiller wanted to offer a drink with a light, delicate, soft flavor that would have broad appeal. We think that the day when a man demanded a drink that would shake back his teeth is nearing an end, the blender said. In referencing Calvert Extra's soft flavor, Seagram deployed the language of sensory taste to convey ambiguous messages about Calvert Extra's psychoactive effects. Launched 3 years after the Distilled Spirits Institute lifted its self-imposed ban on representing women in liquor ads, Calvert Extra directly appealed to women consumers who were increasingly doing the household liquor shopping. This ad on the left here assured whiskey drinkers that Calvert Extra treated its drinkers so tenderly that a lady can even drink soft whiskey straight without batting an eyelash. Seagram's ads made Calvert Extra the whiskey for those who wanted potency, but didn't want to taste that potency or feel its burn. The real genius of the campaign, however, lay in the way it struck an ambiguously androgynous pose to address men's and women's desires for a drink that fostered conviviality without risking the embarrassment of public drunkenness. Despite the limited taste vocabularies of post-war consumers, the descriptors that Dichter's respondents used to characterize good and bad whiskey give us some insight into the values, preoccupations, and aesthetic sensibilities that shaped middle-class life and middle-class masculinities in the post-war era. Was Dichter correct that consumers were merely parroting advertising claims when they praised whiskeys that were mild, smooth, and light? To some extent, yes, but as advertisers understood all too well, words like mild and smooth also functioned as a code for the type of intoxicating experience consumers might anticipate.